It was an ordinary day at the hospital. The kind of day where everything seemed to move in rhythm, the footsteps of nurses, the quiet murmur of patients' conversations, and the endless beep of machines in the background. For most people who worked in the hospital, it was just another shift. But for Jacob, a single father who had worked as a janitor at this very hospital for over a decade, it was much more. He had walked these halls every day, cleaned these rooms, and wiped away the dust from the walls that seemed to hold the stories of so many lives, some joyful, some tragic. Jacob had always found comfort in the routine. The hospital, despite its sterile smell and the constant reminders of life's fragility, was the one place he could disappear into his work and forget. It had become his refuge. After losing his daughter, Emily, in a car accident several years ago, he had retreated into the steady rhythm of his job. He didn't need much else. He had no family left, except for her, and it was too painful to face the world without her. So, he worked long hours, cleaning up after the doctors, nurses, and patients, trying to keep his mind busy and his heart numb. That morning, Jacob was pushing his cleaning cart through the corridor, the quiet hum of the wheels on the floor echoing in the empty space. It was an unusually quiet morning, which was exactly how he liked it. The hospital's hallways were less crowded, and he was almost done with his work for the day. But as he passed by the hospital's lobby, something caught his eye. A small crowd had gathered in front of a display wall, and there was a soft murmur of voices. Curious, Jacob slowed his pace and peered over at what was drawing the attention of everyone. On the wall, in a frame, was a portrait beautifully painted, with vivid colors that seemed almost alive. The girl in the portrait was young, with large, innocent eyes that seemed to stare directly at him. She had a gentle smile that held a kind of quiet wisdom. There was a soft glow around her, as if the painting itself was trying to capture the essence of her spirit. Jacob stopped in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the noise of the hospital seemed to fade away. He stared at the painting, unable to move. His breath caught in his throat, and his hands, which had been tightly gripping the handle of his cleaning cart, began to tremble. It was as though time had stopped, and he had been transported back to a time he desperately tried to forget. The girl in the portrait looked exactly like Emily. At first, Jacob tried to dismiss it. It couldn't be her. He had seen so many children pass through this hospital over the years, and it was not unusual for there to be portraits of young patients displayed as part of some charity or community project. But this was different. The smile on this girl's face, the sparkle in her eyes, it was Emily's smile. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. Could it be a coincidence? Was there any chance that this was just another little girl who happened to look like Emily? He leaned in closer, trying to see if he was mistaken. The longer he stared at the painting, the more the feeling of familiarity washed over him. He could almost hear Emily's laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she was excited. He could picture her running around in the yard of their old home, chasing after butterflies, her brown hair bouncing with every step. The memories flooded his mind, memories he had locked away in the deep corners of his heart. She was gone now, but in this moment, looking at the portrait, it felt like she was still here, alive, present. Suddenly, the door to the lobby opened, and a nurse stepped inside, breaking his trance. "Jacob," she called out, noticing him standing in front of the portrait. "You're here early today." Jacob slowly turned to face her, his mind still reeling. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just finishing up my rounds," he muttered, his voice sounding distant, even to his own ears. The nurse, a woman named Lisa, followed his gaze to the painting. "It's a beautiful piece, isn't it?" she said, her voice warm and kind. "It's part of the hospital's new art exhibit. We're trying to showcase the stories of children who have stayed here and the impact they've had on everyone. This one is especially meaningful." Jacob blinked, his gaze never leaving the portrait. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Lisa paused for a moment, as if trying to recall the details. Her name was Emily. Emily Peters, she said softly. She was one of our young patients. She was here for a short time, but her story touched so many of us. We decided to honor her with this portrait. It was painted by one of the volunteers who works with us, Sarah. She was inspired by Emily's bravery and strength. We thought it would be a fitting tribute. A lump formed in Jacob's throat, and he felt his knees go weak. The world seemed to spin around him as the nurse's words sank in. Emily. Emily Peters. It was his daughter. It was his Emily. He felt the overwhelming flood of emotions surge up from deep inside him. Anger. Pain. Grief. His chest tightened. And for a brief moment, he felt like he was suffocating. How could they have known? How could they have painted her portrait without ever knowing her? His mind raced, and he felt his heart begin to ache with the weight of everything he had tried so hard to forget. Lisa, noticing the change in his expression, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Jacob," she said softly, her voice understanding. "I didn't realize you were related to her. We were all so moved by her story. I should have known it might be difficult for you." Number. Jacob swallowed hard, forcing himself to steady his breath. He turned to Lisa, his face pale. I didn't know. I didn't know her portrait was here." His voice wavered as he spoke, and he felt the tears start to sting his eyes. The nurse nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I understand," she said quietly. "It's a tough reminder for anyone who's lost a child, but I hope you can see it as a way for her to live on. She touched so many hearts here. Your daughter was truly something special, Jacob." Jacob stood there, staring at the painting, his emotions swirling. He didn't know what to feel. His grief was sharp and sudden, but a small part of him felt comforted too. The portrait was more than just a painting. It was a memory, a tribute to the daughter he had loved so deeply. As he looked at her smiling face, he realized that, in some way, she was still with him. And maybe, just maybe, this painting was the first step in healing the wound he had carried all these years. Jacob sat quietly on the bench outside the hospital, the weight of the portrait still heavy in his chest. His thoughts raced, taking him back to a time long before he became the man he was now. Before the grief, the pain, and the endless nights spent crying alone in the dark, he could still remember the first time he held Emily in his arms. She was so small, so fragile, with tiny fingers that wrapped around his thumb as if she had been waiting her whole life to hold on to him. That moment, the first time he looked into her big, brown eyes, was the moment his world changed forever. She was his little miracle, his reason for waking up every day. She was his world, and he would have done anything to protect her. The memories flooded back, one after another, until it was as if Emily was standing there beside him, smiling at him with her bright, radiant face. He remembered the way she used to run around their small house, her laughter filling every corner. She had a way of making everything brighter. Even on the darkest days, her energy was contagious, and no matter how tough life seemed, Emily always found a way to bring hope to the people around her. Jacob smiled at the thought of her playing in their backyard, chasing after the butterflies that seemed to always flutter around her. She would giggle as they landed on her outstretched hand, as if they were her little friends. And Jacob would watch, heart full, as she ran in circles with pure joy on her face. She was so full of life, so full of promise. He had always dreamed of watching her grow up, of seeing her graduate from school, get married, and have children of her own. But that future was taken away from him in the blink of an eye. It happened so suddenly, so violently. One moment, Emily had been holding his hand, asking if she could cross the street to visit a friend. And the next, there was a screeching sound, a terrible crash, and everything went silent. Jacob still couldn't shake the memory of that moment, the sight of his daughter, lying motionless in the middle of the road, the echo of the car's horn ringing in his ears. He had rushed to her side, his heart pounding, his hands shaking as he called out her name, hoping no, praying that she would wake up, that everything would somehow be okay. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. Emily was gone. The days after that were a blur. Jacob had found himself numb, lost in a fog of disbelief and sorrow. The world around him seemed to move in slow motion, as if it had no meaning anymore. He didn't want to face the reality of losing his daughter. He didn't want to accept that he would never hear her laugh again, or see her smile. She had been his reason for living, and now, without her, everything felt empty. In the months that followed, Jacob did his best to keep going, to keep breathing. But the pain was unbearable. Every corner of their house seemed to remind him of her. Her toys were still scattered around, her drawings still taped to the refrigerator. The scent of her shampoo lingered in the bathroom, and the sound of her favorite songs played over and over in his mind. It felt as though the world had frozen, and he had been left behind in a life that no longer made sense. Jacob tried to find comfort in his work. He had always been a quiet man, content with the simplicity of his life. But after Emily's death, the hospital became more than just a place where he worked. It became his escape. When he cleaned the floors, washed the windows, and polished the hallways, he could disappear into the tasks, leaving his grief behind. The work was steady, predictable, and he liked it that way. It didn't ask him to feel anything, but the grief never truly went away. Every day, as he moved through the hospital's halls, he couldn't escape the constant reminders of life's fragility. He saw parents visiting their children, doctors and nurses working together to save lives. He heard the sound of babies crying in the maternity ward, and every time he passed the pediatric ward, he couldn't help but think of Emily. He would often see young patients, some fighting for their lives, others recovering from surgeries, and it would take everything he had not to break down right there in front of them. He had never been able to look at children without feeling a pang of loss in his heart. Emily should have been one of them. But as the years passed, Jacob built walls around his heart. He didn't let himself feel the pain anymore. He couldn't. It was too much. He had to keep going. He had to keep his job, pay the bills, and survive. He didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Sometimes, though, when the hospital was quiet and he had a moment alone, he would sit down on one of the benches in the hallway and let the memories come rushing back. That's when the tears would come, too. It wasn't often. But when they came like a flood, washing over him and leaving him feeling drained and empty. He didn't talk to anyone about it. No one at the hospital knew the full extent of his pain. They saw him as a hard-working janitor, a quiet man who did his job and went home at the end of the day. But they didn't know what he carried with him every day. Jacob had never allowed himself to grieve fully. He had always been afraid to. He feared that if he let go of his pain, he would lose the last piece of Emily he had left. Holding on to the grief, as unbearable as it was, felt like the only way to keep her close. The portrait in the hospital lobby had opened up a floodgate of emotions Jacob had buried for years. He wasn't sure why it had hit him so hard. Foreman. He had seen hundreds of pictures and paintings in the hospital over the years, but none of them had affected him like this one. It was as if Emily herself had come back to him through that image, a reminder that she was gone, but never truly forgotten. His thoughts drifted again to the accident. He remembered the fear he felt in those early days, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had wanted to be there for her, to protect her, but he had failed. And that was something he couldn't forgive himself for. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it was his fault. He should have been more careful. He should have kept her close. But life didn't work that way, did it? Jacob knew he couldn't go back and change what had happened. The past was the past. All he could do now was try to live with the memories, to find some way to keep Emily's spirit alive. The thought of never seeing her again, of never hearing her voice, was unbearable. But in a way, the portrait had given him a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to let go of Emily completely. Maybe he could find a way to carry her memory with him, to honor her, and to find peace. Jacob had always been a man of few words. He wasn't the type to speak out or ask questions, and that had never bothered him before. After Emily's death, he had learned to keep his emotions to himself, to bear the weight of his grief in silence. But something about the portrait, the unexpected and eerie likeness to his daughter, left him restless, unsure of what to do with the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time he closed his eyes, Emily's face seemed to appear in his mind. The same face from the painting. Her smile so familiar, and yet so distant. Jacob's mind kept racing. Why was the portrait here? Why now? He needed to know more about it. He needed answers. And so, despite his natural tendency to keep to himself, Jacob decided to do something he had never done before. He would ask. The next day, after his shift ended, Jacob made his way toward the hospital's main lobby again, where the portrait still hung on the wall. The crowd that had gathered the day before was gone, and the area was quiet. The picture, however, remained, and for a moment it felt as though the eyes of the girl were watching him, waiting for him to understand. A few people were still walking around, but Jacob didn't care. His mind was focused on one thing: finding out who had painted the portrait and why it was so familiar. He spotted Sarah, one of the hospital's volunteers who had been working with the hospital's art program for several months. She was a young woman, in her late 20s, with a gentle smile and a kind face. Jacob had seen her around from time to time, but he had never spoken to her before. He wasn't sure if she would know anything, but it was worth a try. "Excuse me," Jacob said, his voice tentative as he approached her. Sarah looked up from the small stack of papers she was holding and smiled when she saw him. "Hello," she said warmly. "Can I help you with something?" Jacob hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. His heart was racing, and his thoughts felt scattered. He glanced toward the painting. "I saw the portrait," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "The one in the lobby." Sarah's eyes brightened at the mention of the painting. "Oh, I'm glad you noticed it," she said, her smile growing. "It's part of a special project we've been working on here at the hospital. We wanted to showcase the lives of some of the children who have passed through these walls, to honor their memory." Jacob nodded slowly, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if he should ask what was on his mind, but he couldn't help himself. "The girl in the painting." He trailed off, unsure of how to phrase the question. Sarah looked at him curiously. "What about her?" she asked, gently. Jacob swallowed hard. Her name. What was her name? The question seemed simple enough, but as soon as he asked it, he felt a sharp pang of fear deep inside. Could it be her? Could that girl in the painting really be Emily? Sarah, without hesitation, answered. "Her name was Emily Peters," she said softly. "She was one of our patients. She passed away a few years ago." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to blur. Emily Peters. The name felt like a distant echo. His daughter's name. He could barely speak. The flood of emotions that rushed through him was almost overwhelming. He had to hold onto the edge of the table in front of him to steady himself. She was my daughter," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah's face softened with understanding. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her tone compassionate. "I didn't realize." Jacob nodded slowly, his mind racing. How did you know about her? About Emily?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "I didn't know her personally," she explained. "But when I first started volunteering here, I was asked to create a painting that would honor the children who passed away in this hospital. Emily's story was one of the first ones I heard. The nurses, the doctors, everyone had such kind things to say about her. They told me how strong she was, how brave. She touched so many people during her time here. When I saw her photo in the hospital's files, I knew I had to paint her. I wanted to capture that strength, that light that she brought into the lives of everyone who met her. Jacob felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The idea that Emily's spirit had left such an impression on the people in this hospital, that her story had been shared with others, filled him with both pride and sadness. Emily had never been forgotten, even though he had spent so much time trying to forget his own pain. I didn't know, Jacob said quietly. I didn't know anyone remembered her like that. Sarah gave him a sad, understanding smile. Of course they did. Emily was special. She had a way of making people feel like they mattered, even in the hardest moments. And I wanted to make sure her memory lived on, that her strength was honored. That's why I painted her the way I did. I wanted everyone to see her for the brave, beautiful soul that she was. Jacob stood there for a long time, silent. His thoughts were swirling, and he was struggling to process everything Sarah had just told him. Part of him felt angry that he had never known how deeply Emily had touched the lives of others. He had been so consumed by his grief that he had never reached out to see how her memory had been honored. Another part of him felt strangely comforted, though. Knowing that Emily's story had been shared, knowing that others had recognized her spirit, brought a sense of peace that Jacob hadn't felt in years. I'm sorry, he said softly, his voice catching in his throat. I don't know what to say. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder gently. You don't have to say anything. I'm just glad you know now. I'm glad you know how much she meant to all of us. Jacob nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of connection to the world around him. It wasn't just the hospital or the people here that mattered, it was Emily's legacy. The memory of her love, her laughter, her strength, was alive in the hearts of so many. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to begin healing, to find his own way to honor her memory. He thanked Sarah and left the lobby, his heart lighter than it had been in years. But as he walked down the corridor, he couldn't help but glance back at the portrait one more time. There she was, his Emily. And for the first time in a long while, he smiled. The days that followed Jacob's conversation with Sarah were filled with an emotional whirlwind. He found himself thinking about Emily more than ever. He had always tried to keep his pain locked away. But now, after seeing her portrait, hearing her story from others, and learning just how deeply she had impacted the lives of those around her, the floodgates had opened. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt as though the walls he had built around his heart were starting to crack. At night, when he lay in bed, he would close his eyes and see Emily's face. But this time, it wasn't just the memory of the little girl he had lost. It was a new memory, one that had been slowly forming in his mind. She hadn't just been his daughter. She had been something much bigger, someone whose spirit had touched the world, even in her short time here. Jacob hadn't realized how deeply he had buried his grief until he saw the portrait. It was as if he had been walking around in a fog for years, moving through life with his head down, avoiding any reminders of the pain he couldn't bear. But now, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Emily's memory was alive in the hospital, in the faces of the people who remembered her, and in the beautiful portrait that hung on the wall. And somehow, seeing that painting had made him realize something he hadn't even known he needed. He could still carry her memory without the constant weight of sorrow. The next morning, Jacob decided to do something he had never done before. For years, he had avoided talking about Emily with anyone. The pain had always felt too raw, too fresh. But now, as he walked through the hospital's hallways, something had shifted. He realized that if he could start letting go of the anger and the sorrow, perhaps he could begin to live again, not just for himself, but for Emily too. He walked into the hospital's pediatric ward, a place he had often avoided. It was where the youngest patients stayed, children fighting illnesses, recovering from surgeries, or waiting for treatments. Jacob had always stayed away from the children's rooms, afraid of being reminded of the little girl he had lost. But now, with Emily's portrait still fresh in his mind, he felt a pull, a desire to do something that would honor her memory. The nurse at the front desk recognized Jacob immediately. "Hi, Jacob," she said with a smile. "How are you today?" "I'm doing all right," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "Actually, I was hoping I could help out. If there's anything I can do to help the kids here, I'd like to." The nurse raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You want to help? But you've always kept to yourself, Jacob. You've never asked about volunteering or anything like that." Jacob nodded, understanding her surprise. "I know, but I think it's time for me to start giving back. I've been here for so long, and I've watched a lot of children come and go. I've always felt like I couldn't really connect with them, but I think it's time I try. I want to do something that matters." The nurse smiled warmly, clearly moved by his words. "That's wonderful, Jacob. We're always looking for volunteers to help. You could come and play games with the kids, or just talk to them. They love having visitors." Jacob's heart swelled with emotion. He knew it wouldn't be easy to get involved with the children, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. And so, he started spending more time in the pediatric ward. At first, it felt awkward and uncomfortable. The children were so full of life, and Jacob couldn't help but feel the sting of his own loss. He would watch them run around, laugh, and play, and it reminded him so much of Emily when she was young. But as the days went on, Jacob found himself slowly connecting with the children. He started playing board games with them, reading stories, and just sitting with them while they colored or worked on puzzles. He wasn't a natural at it, and sometimes he didn't know what to say, but the children seemed to appreciate his presence. They would smile when he walked into their rooms, excited to have someone new to talk to. Jacob realized that, despite his pain, he still had something to offer. His presence, his quiet kindness, was enough to make the children feel comforted. As the weeks passed, Jacob began to see how his time with the children was healing him in ways he hadn't expected. Each laugh, each moment of joy he shared with them, chipped away at the layers of sorrow he had been carrying for so long. It wasn't about forgetting Emily, it was about keeping her memory alive in a way that brought light instead of darkness. One afternoon, while Jacob was sitting with a young girl named Lily, who was coloring a picture of a rainbow, he found himself talking about Emily for the first time in years. He hadn't planned to bring her up, but Lily's innocence and curiosity made it feel natural. "Do you have any kids, Mr. Jacob?" Lily asked, looking up from her drawing. Jacob smiled softly. "Yes, I have a daughter. Her name was Emily." Lily looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "What happened to her?" "One." Jacob's heart tightened in his chest, but he took a deep breath before speaking. "She passed away a long time ago," he said quietly. "She was very special to me." Lily's small hand reached out and touched his. "I'm sorry about your daughter, Mr. Jacob, but she sounds like she was really nice." Jacob felt a lump form in his throat. "She was," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the most amazing little girl you could ever imagine." Lily smiled, her eyes full of kindness. "Maybe she's in the stars, watching over you," she said softly. Jacob's heart ached, but he smiled down at her. "I think you're right, Lily," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "I think she's in the stars." From that moment on, Jacob began to feel a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Every day spent with the children in the ward, every smile, every word of comfort, reminded him that life was still worth living. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but the love and joy he saw in the children's eyes gave him the courage to face his own grief head-on. In the days that followed, Jacob became a regular presence in the pediatric ward. He wasn't just there to clean, he was there to give back, to share in the light that Emily had brought to the world. He began to share his own stories of her with the children, telling them about her love for butterflies, her bright laugh, and the way she could make anyone smile. The children listened, captivated by the tales of the little girl who had once been so full of life. And as he spoke, Jacob realized that he was no longer haunted by the pain of losing her. He would never forget Emily, but he no longer needed to be consumed by grief. In a way, helping these children, caring for them, playing with them, allowed him to keep Emily's spirit alive in his heart. She had been his light, and now, he could be the light for others. For the first time in a long time, Jacob felt the weight of his grief lift. He could finally breathe again. And with each passing day, as he worked to heal, he realized that Emily's memory wasn't something he needed to let go of. It was something he could carry with him forever. And that, he realized, was a beautiful gift. Jacob woke up early the next morning, the soft light of the sun streaming through his bedroom window. It was a peaceful morning, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of calm that he had never imagined could be possible. The weight that had once settled heavily in his chest seemed to have lifted. Just a little. He stretched his arms above his head and sat up slowly, feeling the quiet stillness of the house around him. It wasn't that he didn't miss Emily, that ache would always be there, as natural as breathing. But now, there was something different. A lightness in his heart. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to move forward. It had been months since Jacob had decided to give back, to volunteer with the children in the pediatric ward. At first, it had been difficult. He hadn't known how to connect with the kids. Their laughter, their energy, it was a reminder of the joy he had lost. But something had changed over time. He had learned to enjoy their company, to be present with them without feeling the sting of loss quite so sharply. Each day spent with the children was a step closer to healing. But Jacob's transformation wasn't just happening at the hospital. As he worked with the children, he also began to reconnect with life outside the walls of the hospital. He would take evening walks around the park near his home, something he hadn't done in years. He would visit the local coffee shop, where the barista, a young woman named Jenna, would always greet him with a warm smile. It was small, simple moments like these that reminded him that the world still held beauty. He didn't need to hide from it anymore. That morning, as he made himself a cup of coffee, Jacob thought about the portrait, the one in the hospital lobby. It had been several weeks since he had first seen it, and each time he looked at it, he felt something stir inside him. The portrait wasn't just a painting anymore. It had become a symbol of hope, a symbol of the love he had for Emily that would never fade. He had once feared that remembering her would only bring more pain, but now he saw that it was different. The memories he had of Emily, her laughter, her bright eyes were a part of him, and they always would be. And those memories could bring him strength, not sadness. Jacob made his way to the hospital later that morning, as he had done every day. He still worked his shift as a janitor, but it was no longer just a job. He had started taking pride in the small things he did, keeping the hallways clean, making sure the waiting areas were tidy, and sometimes just offering a kind word to the visitors. He had realized that his role in the hospital, though simple, was just as important as any doctor or nurse. He was a part of something bigger, something that made a difference. When Jacob walked into the pediatric ward that day, he was greeted by the familiar sight of the children, all going about their activities. Some were sitting with nurses, others were playing games or drawing. The children, though dealing with their own battles, were filled with life. Jacob couldn't help but smile as he watched them. This was where he belonged now. He walked over to Lily, the little girl who had first helped him open up about Emily. She was sitting at a table with a few other kids, coloring a picture of a rainbow. Lily looked up and waved at him, her bright eyes shining with excitement. "Hi, Mr. Jacob," she called out, her voice full of joy. "Look, I made a picture for you." Jacob walked over to her, his heart swelling with warmth. The picture was of a butterfly, with colors so vibrant it almost seemed to jump off the page. He remembered how much Emily had loved butterflies when she was young, how she would chase them through the yard, laughing all the while. "It's beautiful, Lily," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "You know, Emily loved butterflies too. She would have loved this picture." Lily's face lit up. "I made it for her," she said simply. "She's in the stars, right? Watching over us?" Jacob nodded, feeling the tears begin to sting his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice breaking a little. "She's in the stars, and she's always with us. Unsansas, and in jumdas pated with crum. Unsansas, unsumptant, and in jumdas patis, and in jumdas patis, and in jumdas patis, and in jumdas patis." As he sat down at the table with Lily and the other children, something shifted in Jacob. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to the world again. He had spent so much time locked in his grief, unable to open himself up to anyone. But now, as he looked at these children, who had their own battles to fight, he realized that life was still worth living. There was still so much love to give, and so much joy to be found, even in the darkest of times. After a while, the children's laughter and the sound of their voices filled the room, and Jacob found himself laughing along with them. He had never imagined that he would be able to find joy again after losing Emily. But in this moment, surrounded by these children, he realized that life went on, and maybe that was what Emily would have wanted. She had been full of life, full of energy, and now, in her honor, Jacob was finding his way back to that same spirit. Later that afternoon, Jacob was asked to join a small ceremony that was being held in the hospital to honor the children who had passed away. It was a quiet gathering, just a handful of doctors, nurses, and families. But it was a special moment. The ceremony was meant to celebrate the lives of the children who had left an impact, no matter how brief their time had been. As Jacob stood there, listening to the stories being shared, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had spent so many years feeling lost, consumed by grief. But now, surrounded by the love and care of the hospital staff and the families of the children, he understood that Emily's spirit wasn't something that had to be buried in the past. It was something that lived on in every act of kindness, every smile shared, and every memory kept alive. Emily's memory would always be a part of him, and he could carry it forward in the way he lived his life. After the ceremony, Jacob found himself standing in front of the portrait once again. This time, he didn't feel the same overwhelming sorrow that had gripped him when he first saw it. Instead, he felt peace. The girl in the painting, his daughter, was more than just a memory. She was a part of him, and now, he knew he could move forward. As he stood there, he made a silent promise to Emily. He would continue to live, to give, and to love. He would honor her every day, not through the weight of grief, but through the beauty of life. Jacob walked out of the hospital that evening with a lighter heart. It had been a long journey, one that would never truly end, but he had taken the first steps toward healing. And as he looked up at the stars that night, he knew Emily was watching over him, just as Lily had said. And in that moment, Jacob felt a sense of peace, a peace that would stay with him for the rest of his life.